Chapters 5 and 6 of Napoleon and Marie-Louise, The Fall of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 5. 1807. The Break with England. In accordance with the agreement at Tilsit, the Czar had offered his mediation at London. Under date of the 29th of August, the British government replied that it desired first of all to know the just and equitable principles upon which France intended to negotiate. It also demanded that there should be communicated to it the secret articles of the Treaty of Tilsit. As it was impossible under the agreement with Napoleon to comply with this latter request, the English answer in fact rejected the mediation. In spite of the best efforts of her secret spies, England had been able to obtain only a vague idea of the arrangements entered into at Tilsit. Reduced to conjecture, the government imagined that, as had happened 6 years before, after Marengo, Napoleon and Alexander proposed to form a league with Sweden and Denmark to combat the British supremacy on the seas. In this alliance Denmark, with her powerful fleet and nation of sailors, seemed destined to play the principal role. To anticipate these plans, England resolved to strike a decisive blow. It is impossible to deny that the British cabinet had penetrated the secret thoughts of Napoleon, and had only anticipated his probable action, but the brutal manner in which the project was carried out, and the violation of treaties, inspired universal sympathy for the victim. Early in August, an English army was landed in Denmark, and a fleet of 37 vessels, under the command of Parker and Nelson, took up its station before Copenhagen. The 1st of September, after several summons had been courageously refused, the bombardment of the city began, and continued for 5 days. Then, after the partial destruction of the capital by fire, and the deaths of hundreds of citizens, Copenhagen surrendered, and Nelson seized and carried away the Danish fleet. The Emperor was enraged at the news of this dastardly attack, but it only moved him to close tighter the barrier of the continental blockade. One of the characteristic traits of Napoleon was a prodigious faculty of evolving according to circumstances, of continually modifying and renewing his designs in view of the varying course of events. In the destruction of the Danish fleet he saw an opportunity of bringing renewed pressure on Russia to close the north to English goods, while he himself took charge of the south. The indirect results of the bombardment of Copenhagen were to be the occupation of the Iberian Peninsula by French troops, and the Spanish War, which so drained the resources of the Emperor. In a letter to Alexander the last of September, Napoleon said, "I think that it will be easy for us to expel them, the English, entirely from the continent. A joint declaration will produce that effect." 2 weeks later, Champagny, who had succeeded Talleyrand as Minister of Foreign Affairs, in a long despatch to Savary reminds him that Russia had undertaken to declare war on the 1st of December, and adds, "The ports of Portugal and of Sweden ought also to be closed by agreement or by force. Naturally France should take charge of those of Portugal, and Russia of those of Sweden. The two courts should take concerted action with the cabinet of Vienna to make it embrace the common cause." This last demand was anticipated by Austria, who promptly recalled her ambassador from London. On the 7th of November, Napoleon ordered Savary to communicate this news to Alexander, and said, "It will be shameful for Russia to have been behindhand, but I hope that Lord Gower is already dismissed." Upon receipt of the first news from Copenhagen, the Czar had sent Gower a formal note of protest, and had informed Savary at the same time that he was ready to act as soon as the Emperor gave the signal. But it is more than doubtful whether Alexander was sincere in his statements. For some time England had maintained at St. Petersburg an agent by the name of Sir Robert Wilson, who had gained a high position in the society of the capital. Well received everywhere, Wilson had posed as the antagonist of Savary, whom he termed "the executioner of the Duc d'Enghien." But Wilson overreached himself in his intrigues. He introduced into Russia a brochure entitled "Reflections on the Peace of Tilsit," which contained, besides the usual attacks on France, some very scurrilous passages regarding Alexander. Savary finally succeeded in procuring a copy, and the next day, when invited to dine with the Czar, laid the pamphlet before him. After reading it, Alexander displayed as much grief as indignation, against the traitors whom he encountered everywhere in his path, against the agents incapable of understanding and serving him." In parting with Savary he promised a severe admonition to the guilty parties, and this time his deed was as good as his word. He immediately dismissed 2 of his ministers, returned without reading a letter from Wilson, and issued a few days later, on the 7th of November, a fulminating declaration against the British government, declaring a suspension of relations, and indicating the declaration of war. Thus, more than 3 weeks before the date fixed at Tilsit, and before receiving the urgent appeal of his ally, a libellous brochure led the Czar to break with England. Great credit was undoubtedly due to Savary for the ability with which he had handled a very difficult situation. A change in the ministry about this time also had an important bearing upon Russian policy. Against his violent protest, Rumenzoff, the Minister of Commerce, was given also the portfolio of foreign affairs. Nicholas Rumenzoff was the most glorious survivor of another age. Distinguished for a long time by honorable services, possessed of an immense fortune, highly esteemed at court, grand seigneur in every sense of the term, he brought a new dignity to his office. He accepted the position, although with regret, because he saw a great opportunity to serve his country. Rumenzoff was a statesman of the old school, who considered that the true interests of Russia lay to the Orient, along the Danube and the Black Sea, and was opposed to the modern idea of mingling in the quarrels of the continent. Born in 1754, son of a distinguished general of the 7 Years' War, who had been the first to carry the imperial eagles beyond the Danube, Nicholas preserved the recollections of the glorious days of the Great Catherine. At the debut of the new reign, when Russia exhausted her resources in a vain struggle against the power of Napoleon, instead of following in the steps of Catherine along the Danube, Rumenzoff took but little part in public affairs. The Treaty of Tilsit, which indicated a return toward an Oriental policy, seemed to mark him as the man destined to take the head of the Foreign Office. Called to power, he brought to his office more decided views than those of his master, more audacity and more foresight. He was even more inclined than Alexander to a partition of Turkey, and saw in the East a favorable opportunity to secure a notable increase of territory. From the first, Rumenzoff showed himself opposed to the projects of Wilson and friendly to France. He tried to secure a copy of the famous brochure to lay it before the Czar, but was not successful. He encouraged Alexander to take a decided stand, and was very influential in bringing about the final rupture with Great Britain. But it was soon evident that the Czar expected to receive his reward for the action he had taken. After having announced to Savary the break with England, he abruptly turned the conversation to the Orient, and recalled the terms in which Napoleon at Tilsit had spoken of the dismemberment of Turkey. He asked Savary to transmit formally to the Emperor his demand for the 2 principalities. He wished to unite Moldavia and Wallachia to his empire, regardless of any final decision as to the partition of the Ottoman Empire. "This matter is very interesting to me," wrote Napoleon at this time, "but it is necessary to proceed very slowly." The difficulty was to satisfy Alexander while at the same time conserving the interests of France. In the pursuit of this end, one idea dominated him: not to permit any aggrandizement of Russia without an equal advantage for France. In view of all the French conquests, this conception seems illogical to the last degree. In the balance of the profits to each country, Napoleon is not willing to take into consideration Italy, where he is annexing the province of Tuscany, nor Spain and Portugal, which he already contemplates bringing within the sphere of his influence. In 1805, Napoleon had vanquished Russia and Austria without Prussia. In 1806 and 1807, he had beaten Prussia and Russia without Austria. The reports of Savary had convinced him that the Russian alliance depended entirely upon the personal friendship of the Czar, and might be broken at any moment. He knew also that with Russia there was no midway between intimacy and bad terms, between alliance and war. A rupture with Russia would certainly add that nation to the list of his foes, and a conflict with the 3 great continental powers would be so unequal as to endanger the imperial establishment. He already regretted having yielded at Tilsit to the insistence of the Czar, and abandoned his first thought of destroying the Prussian monarchy, thereby violating the precept of the great Frederick, "Ne jamais maltraiter un adversaire à demi." The Grand Army had as yet retired but a step. It was still quartered between the Elbe and the Vistula. Königsberg had been restored to the king, but the French still occupied the rest of the kingdom. The indemnity of 150 millions which Napoleon demanded was beyond the resources of Prussia, and until it was paid he had the right to continue the French occupation. The Emperor was already considering a means of fortifying himself permanently against the hostility of Prussia, when the demands of the Czar brought him a ray of light. As the Czar, in violation of the terms arranged at Tilsit, insisted on keeping the 2 Turkish provinces occupied by his troops, why should not the Emperor, in assuring to his ally Moldavia and Wallachia, return to his first idea, and demand of Prussia the province of Silesia? In losing Silesia, Prussia would be reduced to the limits of the former electorate of Brandenburg. After having stolen provinces from all her neighbors, the Hohenzollerns would be thrown back into the cradle of their race. Despoiled of her richest lands, reduced to a nation of 2,000,000 souls, Prussia would be unable to maintain a large army, and would become only a second-class power. United to Saxony and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, Silesia would materially strengthen the defenses of the Empire. In applying this policy to Prussia, Napoleon would only be following the example set by Frederick himself, who was the instigator and the most active agent in the partition of Poland some 35 years before. Napoleon decided to communicate this new plan immediately to Alexander, and it formed the principal clause in the instructions to Caulaincourt, who was to broach the subject as soon as he arrived at St. Petersburg. This remarkable document, prepared by Champagny, but reviewed and approved by the Emperor, clearly reveals the line of his thought. The solemn act of Tilsit could not be modified to the advantage of only one of the parties. An infraction allowed in the case of Russia should be balanced by one to the profit of France. Such would be the principle of the conduct of the Emperor. Reason, justice, prudence would not allow him to take any other course, and no obstacle could turn him from this path. As long as Russia remained in the Principalities, France would continue the occupation of Prussia, unless the cession of Silesia gave her another guarantee. The alternative was therefore offered to Prussia of remaining a prisoner of war for an indefinite term, or of securing her liberty by the sacrifice of a province. If the Czar agreed to this proposition, a convention modifying the treaty would be secretly exchanged between the 2 sovereigns. Napoleon would undertake to arrange the matter with the Sultan, and Alexander would do the same with Frederick William. The 2 matters would be negotiated simultaneously. In the event that the Czar insisted upon a further partition of Turkey, Caulaincourt was instructed not to offer any opposition, but to state that this step would necessitate a new interview, and direct negotiations between the 2 emperors. A note upon the margin of the ambassador's instructions with the words "dictated by the Emperor" throws further light on the subject. Thus the real desire of the Emperor at this moment is that the Ottoman Empire shall remain in its present integrity, i.e., excluding the principalities already occupied by the Czar, provided Russia agrees that France shall acquire from Prussia an equal augmentation. To sum up, Napoleon suggested 3 plans for settling the question. First, a peace securing to Turkey the restitution of all her provinces, including Moldavia and Wallachia. Second, the abandonment to Russia of the principalities on condition of the cession of Silesia to France. Third, the partition of the Ottoman Empire, provided the 2 emperors arranged the matter at a personal interview. The instructions ended with these words: "Such are the intentions of the Emperor upon this important question of policy. What he would prefer above all is that the Turks should remain in peaceful possession of Wallachia and Moldavia. However, the desire to use tact in dealing with Ménager, the cabinet of St. Petersburg, and to attach more strongly the Emperor Alexander, does not preclude the abandonment of the 2 provinces in consideration of a just compensation to be secured in the provinces of Prussia. Finally, although very reluctant to the partition of the Turkish Empire, and regarding that measure as calamitous, it is not his wish that, in your explanation to the Emperor and his minister, you should absolutely condemn it, but he directs you to represent forcibly the reasons which should defer that epoch. This ancient project of Russian ambition is a bond which may attach Russia to France, and from this point of view you must take care not to discourage entirely her hopes. 6. 1808. The Eastern Question. In deciding upon his ambassador, the Czar had as much trouble as Napoleon, and the selection which he finally made of General Tolstoy, the brother of the Grand Marshal, was most unfortunate. Count Tolstoy had passed the greater part of his life in the army, and when not in active service had lived upon his estates, far from the social and political intrigues of the capital. Although he was not considered a partisan of the French, Alexander thought that his military training, and habits of obedience to orders, would fit him for his new career. On his way to Paris, Tolstoy stopped at Memel to pay his respects to the royal family of Prussia, and was much impressed by the spectacle of their misery. The king and queen were living in a state of poverty, and the sympathies of Tolstoy were aroused. He therefore arrived in France with sentiments very different from those which Napoleon expected in the ambassador of his ally. On the 6th of November, 4 days before the date set for the departure of Caulaincourt, Tolstoy arrived at Fontainebleau, where the court was then in residence, and presented his credentials. He was received with every mark of kindness and distinction by the Emperor. At Paris, Napoleon purchased for 1,000,000 francs the handsome hotel of Murat in Rue Cheruti, and presented it to the ambassador for his official residence. But to all the advances of Napoleon, Tolstoy remained unresponsive. At his first interview with the Emperor, he brought up the question of the evacuation of Prussia, and flatly stated that there could be no peace between Russia and France so long as the first condition of the Treaty of Tilsit was not fulfilled. He was so insistent that Napoleon, much against his will, was forced to explain his position. Tolstoy at once reported the interview to his master, with much exaggeration, stating that the Emperor demanded not only Silesia, but also Berlin and the line of the Oder, with the idea of rounding out the kingdom of Monsieur Jerome, as he called him. Not content with expressing his fears in several reports, he made them the subject of a personal letter to Rumenzoff. Thus, by a combination of unfortunate circumstances, before the arrival of his ambassador, the plans of Napoleon were revealed to Alexander in a most unfavorable light. When Caulaincourt reached St. Petersburg, therefore, he found the Czar suspicious and upset, and his task far more difficult than he had anticipated. Notwithstanding the doubts which oppressed his mind, Alexander gave Caulaincourt a most cordial welcome. On his arrival the ambassador was conducted to the Wolkonsky Palace, the most magnificent in the capital after those of the Czar and the Grand Duke, and was told to consider it as his own. On the 20th of December, Caulaincourt presented his credentials, and the same evening was invited to a spectacle at the Hermitage, where he was seated beside the Grand Dukes in the same line with the imperial family, a distinction without precedent, which impressed the whole court. 2 days later, Caulaincourt was invited by the Czar to one of his intimate private dinners, after which they passed into his cabinet, where they had a long conversation, which the ambassador recounts in his despatches in the form of a dialogue. After expressing to Caulaincourt his pleasure and satisfaction over the Emperor's appointment, and a few words on other topics, Alexander plunged into the subject of Prussia, and said that he could not consider Silesia in connection with the affairs of Turkey. Caulaincourt then explained the real intentions of the Emperor, which had been so distorted by Tolstoy in his reports. Alexander admitted that he presented the case well, but went on to say, "I can never enter into an arrangement of which there never was any question between us, and which would despoil a prince who has already lost so much. I do not doubt the intentions of your Emperor, but it is necessary here to have something to prove to the nation and the army that our alliance is not solely to your advantage." At the end of this interview Caulaincourt left the Czar in better humor, but not convinced. He had touched lightly upon the 3 points in his instructions. He had spoken of a peace with Turkey which would leave everything as before. The Czar had made no response. He had alluded twice to an exchange of Silesia against the principalities. Alexander had been courteous but inflexible. Finally, he had suggested a personal interview between the two emperors to discuss the partition of Turkey, and found that while the Czar was ready for this he was not willing to sacrifice Prussia. In following interviews the Czar showed himself even more cordial and open. Appreciating the tact and discretion of Caulaincourt, he spoke without reserve of his bonne fortune, and particularly of Madame Narishkin. Then he changed the subject to Napoleon, and was frankly curious to know about the private life of the Emperor. He also flattered the amour propre of the ambassador by asking him to tell the story of a love affair which Caulaincourt had had before leaving Paris, and expressed his good wishes for the minister's success. 10 days after his arrival, Caulaincourt gives his impressions of the situation as he sees it, in a very frank letter to the Emperor. "Sire," he writes Napoleon on the 31st of December, "the alliance of Russia with your Majesty, and especially the war with England, have upset all the ideas of this country. It is, one may say, a change of religion." The ambassador then goes on to say that Alexander considers himself in honor bound to procure for Russia advantages in the Orient, in exchange for the sacrifices imposed by the war with England. "Such," he continues, "is his position, or rather his embarrassment, for his chivalry closes the door of escape, which your Majesty opens for him by way of Prussia. The Emperor will certainly triumph over all these obstacles if he does not change his mind, but if he thinks that he has been deceived, no one can calculate the consequences of his reflections." When better informed a little later, Caulaincourt became convinced that the policy of the Czar was not dictated by sentimental reasons only. If he obstinately refused to yield on the question of Silesia, it was less from sympathy for Prussia than from anxiety for his own interests. Alexander and Rumenzoff had divined that Napoleon intended to use that province to strengthen the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and they feared that this annexation was only a prelude to the reestablishment of Poland. If the Czar and his ministers spoke continually of Prussia, they thought all the time of Poland, and it was their dread of seeing that country rise from its ashes which was destined to have in the future a fatal effect upon their understanding with Napoleon. In this arrière-pensée can be found the secret of their vehement opposition to the project of Silesia. "The demand for Berlin would alarm them less," wrote Caulaincourt. Even at this early date the Russian alliance had reached a crisis. The two questions which for a century past had prevented a durable rapprochement between France and Russia, the Orient and Poland, reappeared to day, raised simultaneously; and Napoleon, in trying to solve the first by the second, had only succeeded in complicating them. If it were still possible to save the situation, it was only on condition that Napoleon dissipated the suspicions of Russia, and at the same time satisfied her ambitions. It had become necessary to reassure her on the subject of Poland; urgent to satisfy her at the expense of Turkey. During his visit to Italy in December, 1807, even before the arrival of Caulaincourt at St. Petersburg, Napoleon learned from the despatches of Savary that the Czar, while clinging to the principalities, refused to consent to the annexation of Silesia. The only means of satisfying Russia and indemnifying France was therefore the partition of Turkey by common agreement. At Venice, Napoleon found himself almost upon the frontiers of the Ottoman Empire, and the appeal of the Orient awakened once more in his breast. This, as much as the demands of Russia, lessened his objections to the great undertaking. He wrote Savary at this time: "My first aim, like the first sentiment of my heart, is to modify my policy in such a way as to bring my interests into accord with those of the Emperor Alexander." These words seem to imply the abandonment of Turkey. On his return to Paris, the 1st day of January, 1808, without taking any rest, Napoleon sent for Talleyrand and discussed the Eastern question for 5 hours. Although Talleyrand had given up the portfolio of foreign affairs in becoming Vice Grand Electeur, the Emperor liked to take his advice, and kept him in reserve for consultations on political matters of importance. It was remarked that Napoleon had several more long conferences with his former minister during the next few days, and much curiosity was aroused. The subject discussed on each occasion was the same, and the Emperor, against the advice of Talleyrand, displayed a strong inclination to go ahead with the partition plan. Napoleon's determination to achieve a definite peace with England had become so strong that it had overpowered his usual clear judgment, and he was ready to resort to any means, no matter how extraordinary or superhuman, to gain his end. First of all, he was resolved to close the continent to British goods, and the Spanish question then began to take form in his mind alongside the Eastern plan. In Spain he was still wavering between two policies: whether to overthrow the reigning dynasty, or to make it the instrument of his power. In the Orient he was considering the idea of striking at England through a menace to her Indian empire. While Napoleon was still in this state of indecision, the last of January the English Parliament was opened, with the usual address from the throne, which breathed an indomitable spirit of tenacity, and a determination to carry on the struggle to the bitter end. His Majesty commands us to assure you of his firm persuasion that, with the aid of divine Providence, Great Britain will come out of this conflict with glory and success. When Napoleon read this proud defiance he was filled with rage. He immediately made up his mind to accept the gage of battle, to associate himself more closely with the great empire of the North, and to yield even Constantinople to Alexander as the price of his cooperation. It was in this spirit that he wrote the Czar the famous letter of the 2nd of February, 1808. Monsieur mon frère, General Savary has just arrived. I have passed whole hours with him, in talking of your Majesty. Your Majesty will have seen the late addresses to the English Parliament, and the decision arrived at to push the war à outrance. In this state of affairs I am writing directly to Caulaincourt. If your Majesty will condescend to talk with him, he will state my opinions. It is no longer possible, except by grand and vast measures, for us to arrive at peace, and consolidate our systems. An army of 50,000 men, Russian, French, and perhaps a few Austrians, which is directed on Asia by way of Constantinople, will not have arrived upon the Euphrates before alarming England and putting her at the feet of the continent. I am in force in Dalmatia, your Majesty on the Danube. A month after we are in accord the army could be on the Bosphorus. The blow will echo to the Indies, and England will submit. I do not refuse any of the preliminary stipulations necessary to reach so great an end; but the reciprocal interests of our two states must be combined and balanced. This can be done only in an interview with your Majesty, or pursuant to sincere conferences between Rumenzoff and Caulaincourt, and the sending here of a man in sympathy with our system. Monsieur de Tolstoi is an estimable man, but he is full of prejudices and mistrust against France. All can be signed and decided before the 15th of March. By the 1st of May our troops can be in Asia, and by the same time the troops of your Majesty at Stockholm. Then the English, menaced in the Indies, driven from the Levant, will be crushed under the weight of the events with which the atmosphere will be charged. This letter, of which we have quoted only the principal paragraphs, did not refer to the question of partition, but the one sent Caulaincourt on the same day formally admits it, and explicitly orders him to enter into the details of the plan. The reason for this sudden volte-face in Napoleon's policy hardly seems adequate, and leads one to doubt his sincerity. Did not the appeal to the Czar conceal a piece of trickery? While he was charming Alexander with this magnificent perspective of Oriental conquests, was he not seeking to gain time to carry out his designs on Spain, the only question which seriously preoccupied him at the moment? As soon as the fate of the peninsula was decided, and Europe confronted with a fait accompli, did he not intend to retract insensibly his offers, and allow to fade away the mirage so eloquently evoked? In spite of what he says in this letter to Alexander and his instructions to Caulaincourt, it is also doubtful whether Napoleon had then decided upon a plan of partition. Certainly he had not communicated it to his ambassador, any more than he told the general ordered to open fire at the beginning of a battle, the secret of the operations destined to decide the fate of the day. In diplomacy, as in war, his methods varied little. He opened the battle all along the line. Then, as the combat deepened and he divined the weak point of his adversary, he brought up all his reserves and prevailed over the enemy already worn out by the conflict. In the question of the partition, these tactics are very evident. The debate to open at St. Petersburg was no more than a preliminary skirmish, to feel out the enemy. Upon certain points he was determined not to yield; on others he was resigned to concessions more or less important. Based upon certain passages in the Memorial, it is the general belief that Napoleon never contemplated abandoning Constantinople to Russia. At St. Helena he said, "Constantinople is placed to be the center and the seat of universal domination." Nevertheless, Metternich and Tolstoy have both stated that he accepted the idea of the establishment of Russia on the Bosphorus; and in 1812, in a conversation with Narbonne, he admitted that he had offered the city to Alexander. The contradiction between these different statements can easily be explained by the different circumstances under which they were made. At St. Helena, Napoleon was talking for posterity. In 1808 he was demanding the aid of Russia, to give the finishing blow to England, and was willing to pay the necessary price. The King of Sweden had refused to yield to the demands, even to the menaces of Russia, and close his ports to English goods. Caulaincourt accordingly called on the Czar to fulfill his agreements and declare war. Alexander did not refuse, but was very slow in his preparations, and gave many excuses for his failure to move. Up to this time the Czar had taken no aggressive act against England, and he now hesitated to attack her ally until he was entirely reassured as to Napoleon's intentions. He seemed to fear, if he took possession of Finland, that the Emperor might consider this conquest as an equivalent for the Turkish provinces which had been promised him. Finally, under the continued pressure of the French ambassador, Alexander gave the order for his troops to cross the frontier, and on the 15th of February hostilities began. Once more the Czar had kept his engagements, although no decisive word had yet been received from France. At last, on the 25th of February, Napoleon's letter of the 2nd reached St. Petersburg. Caulaincourt hastened to the palace, and was granted an immediate audience. When he had finished reading the letter, which seemed to fill him with joy, the Czar seized Caulaincourt's hand, and pressing it, said with emotion, "Tell your Emperor how much I am touched by his confidence, how much I desire to second him." He then read the letter to the ambassador, and continued, "General, I can tell you frankly that this letter gives me great pleasure. It is the language of Tilsit. The Emperor can count on me, for you know that I have not changed my tone." But the first feeling of enthusiasm soon gave place to distrust. Alexander and Rumentzoff began to doubt the sincerity of the Emperor. On the last day of February, Caulaincourt wrote that they feared that the proposed partition was a method of changing the question and retaining Silesia without giving Russia a chance to demand the reason. Alexander charged his minister to clear this matter up, and at the first conference between the two negotiators, the principal subject of the interview was the question of Prussia. Rumentzoff demanded the assurance that the new projects implied the express renunciation of all designs on Silesia. Unfortunately, the French ambassador was not authorized to give this assurance. The following day, the 1st of March, Caulaincourt dined at the palace, and the Czar tried to draw him out by assuming that the question was settled. He said, "I am delighted that the matter of Silesia is no longer in question. Frankly, the project of the partition of the Ottoman Empire should annul all that has been proposed and said regarding Prussia since Tilsit. That reestablishes the question as it was consecrated by the treaty." The reply of Caulaincourt was summed up in a phrase borrowed from the instructions of his master. "The Emperor Napoleon urges your Majesty not to press him more than you are pressed." On the important question of Constantinople, Alexander at this time displayed an unexpected moderation, and himself proposed that it should be made a free city. The conferences between Rumentzoff and Caulaincourt began on the 2nd of March, and were continued from day to day. The negotiations, which were reported in great detail by the French ambassador, were certainly the most extraordinary ever recorded in the secret archives of any nation. The minister and the envoy met alone, and conversed in the most informal manner, at a table which was covered with the maps of Europe. With refined courtesy and a tone of light amiability, they sought a solution of the most redoubtable problems ever raised in international politics. They divided up more territories, more provinces, more kingdoms than any congress known to history. With the maps spread out between them, they debated whether the partition should: 1. Take the form discussed at Tilsit, leaving Constantinople and Roumelia to the Turks; or 2. Involve the entire division of Turkey in Europe; or 3. Even go so far as to include the Ottoman possessions in Asia and Africa. During one of their interviews, Rumenzoff spoke of the gouvernement invalide of the Turks, which was probably the first use of the phrase, the sick man of the East, so celebrated later. In transmitting to Napoleon the voluminous report, or rather procès-verbal, of his conferences, Caulaincourt in a personal letter gives a résumé of his impressions. That which strikes him most is the fact that the Russian court, in spite of its joy over the offer of partition, is still full of suspicion. It still feels that the Silesian project conceals the design of the Emperor to re-establish Poland upon the wreck of Prussia. This explains the persistence of the Czar and his minister in demanding a guarantee on the subject of Silesia. The only means of tranquilizing Alexander will be to evacuate Prussia, and, above all, the Grand Duchy. The ambassador does not venture to recommend such a sacrifice, but he does urge the Emperor to repress the ardor of the Poles, and abstain from any measures calculated, in the words of Alexander, to revive the dead, and give the impression of a wish entirely to resurrect them. "In 6 months," writes Caulaincourt, "the embassy will be a canonry, if there is no longer a Silesian question, and if there is an understanding regarding the partition of the Ottoman Empire." Alexander by this time had changed his ideas regarding Constantinople, and the ambassador records his conviction that the Czar will never yield on the point of that city and the Dardanelles. This double question arranged to his satisfaction, all else would be easy. Master of Constantinople, he would go with the Emperor, not only to the Indies, but also to Syria and Egypt, and place his armies and his fleets at the disposal of France. Caulaincourt's letter of the 16th of March concludes with these remarkable words: "Let your Majesty reunite Italy to France, perhaps even Spain. Change dynasties. Found kingdoms. Demand the cooperation of the Black Sea fleet, and of a territorial army to conquer Egypt. Demand whatever guarantees you wish. Make any exchanges you wish with England. In a word, let the world change its place. Provided Russia obtains Constantinople and the Dardanelles, we could, I think, make her contemplate all without disquietude." End of chapters 5 and 6.